What did Ahab do that left him condemned before the Lord? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 1 Kings on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 1 Kings chapter 20, verses 31 to 43, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 1 Kings chapter 20, verse 31, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Kings chapter 20, beginning at verse 31. Then his servant said to him, "Look now, we have heard that the kings of the house of Israel are merciful kings. Please let us put sackcloth around our waists and ropes around our heads and go out to the king of Israel. Perhaps he will spare your life." So they wore sackcloth around their waists and put ropes around their head and came to the king of Israel and said, "Your servant Ben-Hadad says, 'Please let me live.'" And he said, "Is he still alive? He is my brother." Now the men were watching closely to see whether any sign of mercy would come from him, and they quickly grasped at his word and said, "Your brother Ben-Hadad." So he said, "Go, bring him." Then Ben-Hadad came out to him, and he had him come up into the chariot. So Ben-Hadad said to him, "The cities which my father took from your father I will restore, and you may set up marketplaces for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria." Then Ahab said, "I will send you away with this treaty." So he made a treaty with him and sent him away. Now a certain man of the sons of the prophets said to his neighbor by the word of the Lord, "Strike me, please." And the man refused to strike him. Then he said to him, "Because you have not obeyed the voice of the Lord, surely, as soon as you depart from me, a lion shall kill you." And as soon as he left him, a lion found him and killed him. And he found another man and said, "Strike me, please." So the man struck him, inflicting a wound. Then the prophet departed and waited for the king by the road, and disguised himself with a bandage over his eyes. Now as the king passed by, he cried out to the king and said, "Your servant went out into the midst of the battle, and there a man came over and brought a man to me and said, 'Guard this man. If by any means he is missing, your life shall be for his life, or else you shall pay a talent of silver.' While your servant was busy here and there, he was gone. Then the king of Israel said to him, 'So shall your judgment be. You yourself have decided it.' And he hastened to take the bandage away from his eyes. And the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. Then he said to him, 'Thus says the Lord, because you have let slip out of your hand a man whom I appointed to utter destruction, therefore your life shall go for his life, and your people for his people.' So the king of Israel went to his house sullen and displeased, and came to Samaria." In this chapter we had Ben-Hadad of Syria coming to attack Israel. This is a different Ben-Hadad from chapter 15, as by now about 30 years have passed. Ben-Hadad is an arrogant man who believed that his army was stronger than Israel's, and that he would easily defeat them. Yet he hadn't considered one thing. God was on Israel's side. Now yes, Israel had gone off into idolatry, and Ahab was an especially wicked king, but that didn't mean that God approved of just anyone coming up and attacking Israel. He obviously hadn't willed for Syria to do so here, and so he was willing to humble Ben-Hadad by allowing Israel to win. Upon their defeat, Syria retreated from Samaria for the winter, declaring that Israel's God was a God of the mountains. So in the spring, they would attack in the plain, and then they would win. But Jehovah is the God of this universe. He is the God of all, and thus if he was on Israel's side, nobody, anywhere, would defeat him. Which is exactly what Ben-Hadad found out in the spring when he attacked Aphek, which was likely on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Ahab's army, with instructions from the Lord, defeated all of Ben-Hadad's army, with Ben-Hadad now hiding in an inner chamber in Aphek in order to avoid being killed. Which brings us down to verse 31. Ben-Hadad's servants know that their death was inevitable if they did nothing, so they tried to see if Ahab would be merciful to them, for they had heard that the kings of the house of Israel had a tendency to be merciful. Perhaps they had heard of David or Solomon in the past, because I don't know where they would have gotten this idea based on the reputation of the kings of the northern nation of Israel alone. When approached, the servants of Ben-Hadad pled that he not be killed, to which Ahab asked if he was still alive, for he is my brother. Ahab wasn't meaning a familial brother here, instead likely meaning fellow king. But the servants picked up on the language used, and so changed how they referred to Ben-Hadad before Ahab, replacing servant with brother. Ahab asked that Ben-Hadad be brought, which he was, after which he came and sat in Ahab's chariot. Ben-Hadad told Ahab that the cities which his father had taken from Ahab's father would be returned, while at the same time Ahab could set up marketplaces for himself in Damascus, as his father had done in Samaria. What Ben-Hadad is referring to here is not known for certain. Some think this is referring to his father Ben-Hadad's invasion of Baasha, but Baasha is not the father of Ahab or even the same family line, and neither was Samaria in existence as the capital of Israel yet then. Rather, what is likely mentioned is an unrecorded war between Omri and Ben-Hadad I, in which Omri was defeated, at least partially. Whatever the case, what is being talked about here is a peace treaty and a trade pact between Ahab and Ben-Hadad. There is just one problem. God had told Ahab that he had given the Syrians into his hand and wanted their armies destroyed, including Ben-Hadad. At that displeasure on God's part for what Ahab did here is the point of the rest of the chapter. For when Ben-Hadad returned home, that's when God sent his prophet with a message for Ahab. But the prophet in this case didn't just come like Elijah did and tell him the word of the Lord. That type of approach might not work with Ahab, as it hadn't when Elijah tried it either. Rather, the prophet wanted to appear before Ahab injured, so he could tell Ahab a parable. So he asked his neighbor to injure him. When the neighbor did not, the prophet said that because he disobeyed the command of the Lord, that a lion would come and eat the neighbor when he departed. And that's exactly what happened. The prophet found another man and asked him to do the same thing, and this time the word of the prophet was obeyed. Injured now, the prophet disguised himself with a bandage over his face, not only so he could conceal his identity from Ahab, but so the parable he was about to tell made sense. When Ahab passed by, the prophet cried out to the king, saying that he had been in the middle of a battle, when a man brought another man to him and told him to guard the man and not lose him. If the prophet did lose him, then he would either pay with his life or he would pay a talent of silver. In 2023 money, this would be the equivalent of $22,000 Canadian or $17,000 American. The prophet told Ahab that he had indeed lost the man, and implied in this statement is that the prophet wanted Ahab to do something about it. Ahab told the prophet that what's done is done, and that he needed to accept his punishment. With that statement, the prophet took off the bandage, and Ahab knew who this man was. The prophet told him that the Lord had delivered to Ahab Ben-Hadad for punishment, and Ahab had lost him, and because of that, your life will go for his life, and your people for his people. We're going to see this prophecy come to fruition in chapter 22. Ahab understood the prophet's message and went away to his house sullen and displeased. Now, some people might ask, did the prophet lie to Ahab here in order to make his point? And the answer to that appears that he did, in the sense that he claimed these things happened to him when they didn't. Now, yes, the prophet spoke in a parable, but he presented it as a story that actually happened to him. Now, some might say, but didn't God tell him to go speak to Ahab? Which the answer is, yes, he did. And didn't God tell the prophet to disguise himself to do so? For after all, the man who refused to maim the prophet died for disobeying the word of the Lord. And again, that appears to check out, even though we don't read of it directly. But that doesn't necessarily mean the rest of what the prophet did in telling this story was ordained from God, for God wouldn't tell the prophet to lie. God detests lying and never condones it, not even if it brings about good. The prophet could have framed this story slightly differently and gotten the same result, but he chose to present it in this way, and will have to answer to God for what he said and be forgiven of all his sins, just like us. We must remember that prophets can sin too, even if they are on a mission from God. Let's not try to justify something that is sinful just because the man was a prophet of God, or just because the story that the prophet told did actually lead Ahab to accepting the truth when the prophet revealed the word of the Lord. Sin is sin, and we must call it out as such. Ahab, though, knew what he had done was wrong, and that he would suffer the consequences for it. For after all, he understood that by the word of the Lord he was delivered from the Syrians, and so the word of the Lord would come to pass here too. That is what is sad about the biblical narrative of Ahab. He is a man who should have been righteous. He had prophets from God reveal to him the truth. He saw God deliver Israel from her enemies, and yet human pride, human stubbornness, and just plain weakness kept Ahab in his sin. Let's learn this lesson from Ahab. Let's let go of our own will and turn to the Lord by obeying Jesus today. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 to 16, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.